Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up as we dissect the latest act in the grand spectacle of U.S. economic policy. In a move that smells suspiciously like political theater, President Donald Trump recently announced that tariffs against our northern neighbors, Canada and Mexico, are on time and moving along very rapidly. Yet, behind his bombastic assurance lies a story of contradictory signals, half-baked planning, and an overarching trade strategy that seems to have more holes than Swiss cheese. This isn't just a diplomatic spat, it's a microcosm of the administration's broader, and decidedly misguided, approach to economic governance. Let's start by getting our facts straight. According to Trump's recent remarks at a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron, tariffs originally scheduled for next month after a brief delay are slated to hit Canada and Mexico as part of an effort to curtail the flow of undocumented migrants and illegal drugs like fentanyl. The tariffs, a so-called special 25% levy, are being levied under the guise of border security, a claim that has already raised more than a few skeptical eyebrows among experts. Even a U.S. official, speaking anonymously, confessed that this special levy is still up in the air. Meanwhile, reciprocal tariffs against the rest of the globe are on track for an April debut, set to be calculated on a country-by-country basis. In Trump's own words, "We want to have the same, so if somebody charges us, we charge them." For those of us who have been following U.S. economic policy, and trying to keep our sanity, we can't help but notice the inherent absurdity. Here's a leader announcing sweeping tariffs intended to make our country extremely liquid and rich again, yet the very fundamentals of economic theory suggest that imposing such levies without coherent coordination with allies and trading partners risks wreaking havoc on the supply chain, stoking inflation, and ultimately hurting consumers and businesses alike. It wouldn't be hyperbolic to say that the current administration's approach is akin to using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. The fundamental belief here is that by imposing high tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals, you can coax companies into reshoring manufacturing jobs and stimulate domestic investment. Sounds appealing on paper, right? However, as any seasoned economist will tell you, the reality is much grimmer. Mainstream economists, armed with data and historical precedents, vehemently warn that such unilateral tariffs are most likely to lead to unwanted price hikes. Imagine the impact on everyday consumers when goods that rely on Canadian or Mexican inputs see their costs balloon by 10% to 25%. For instance, the auto industry, which thrives on integrated supply chains across North America, could face disruptions leading to production delays and increased vehicle prices. And let's not forget energy. Significant parts of the U.S., notably in the Pacific Northwest and Northeast, depend heavily on low-cost Canadian electricity and gas. When tariffs create a 10% duty on Canadian energy products, it's not just a win for trade protectionism, it's a direct hit to household budgets and small businesses. Let's throw some numbers into the mix. A recent report from the Peterson Institute for International Economics noted that every 1% increase in tariffs on imported goods tends to add roughly 0.2% to consumer price inflation over the subsequent year. Now, with tariffs levied at up to 25% on certain imports, we could be staring at price hikes that spiral beyond what ordinary citizens can comfortably afford. This is not just theoretical musing. Historical examples such as the tariff wars of the 1930s show us a grim picture of economic isolationism exacerbating recessionary pressures. The justification to impose these tariffs is as murky as a polluted river. Trump claims that the tariffs are necessary to stem the tide of undocumented migrants and to keep out a steady flow of illegal drugs like fentanyl. But when you examine the data, it's clear that border security is not something that can be effectively managed through blunt trade barriers. For example, Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly recently turned the tables on this argument by pointing out that the U.S. itself is a net exporter of fentanyl, illegal firearms, and even illegal migrants to Canada. Would you believe it? Essentially, while the rhetoric is aimed squarely at our neighbors, the underlying issues of drug trafficking and migration are not unilateral problems, they are symptoms of a global phenomenon that no tariff or protectionist trade measure can magically solve. In fact, instituting tariffs for border security reasons is a policy alchemy that turns a targeted tool into a broader economic bullet with unpredictable fallout. In a more pragmatic sense, borders should be secured through coordinated enforcement, international cooperation, and targeted policy interventions, not through measures that destabilize integrated markets. In 2023, for instance, the North American Supply Chain Council reported that cross-border trade disruptions cost the regional economy an estimated $50 billion annually. Impairing these channels intentionally, under the banner of national security, risks not only alienating trusted allies but also undermining the very economic stability the tariffs claim to protect. Let's be candid, when you meddle in trade with the kind of heavy-handed measures we're seeing today, you're not just creating headaches for Canada and Mexico, you're destabilizing global supply chains. President Trump's trade policies seem to be driven more by rhetoric than by serious economic planning. History shows us that unforeseen consequences are the norm rather than the exception when disruptive tariffs enter the equation. Take the auto sector, for instance. North America is home to one of the most efficient integrated auto manufacturing ecosystems in the world. When tariffs are suddenly imposed on auto parts, the ripple effects can be monumental. According to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, disruptions in the automotive sector could lead to a significant slowdown in production, with knock-on effects in parts distribution, dealer inventories, and even financing terms. And let's not forget the energy sector, parts of which, such as electricity supplies in the Northeast, are heavily reliant on cross-border flows from Canada. When these channels are snagged by tariff-induced inefficiencies, the resulting ripple can surge up to national levels, affecting everything from industrial output to household energy bills. Moreover, recent data from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, suggests that global trade as a percentage of GDP was expected to decline by approximately 15% if protectionist measures increased at the pace seen over the past year. With tariffs like those announced by Trump, we're not just facing isolated economic frictions, we're staring down the barrel of a potential contraction in global trade, one that could plunge the world economy ever further into the recessionary abyss that critics of these policies have long predicted. Adding to the absurdity is the glaring internal inconsistency within the U.S. policy apparatus regarding these tariffs. The president is steadfast in his declarations, yet high-level U.S. officials are whispering caveats and conditions in backstage corridors. For example, while Trump loudly trumpets his plan for a reciprocal tariff system, if somebody charges us, we charge them, top Commerce Department officials are reportedly still crunching the numbers. This disconnect between political bravado and bureaucratic uncertainty is emblematic of an economic strategy that seems as confused as it is counterproductive. Imagine, if you will, a grand economic stage where the leading actor, the president, confidently strides forward, proclaiming that tariffs will bolster American wealth, while behind the scenes, the supporting cast, government agencies and independent economists, express grave doubts about the actual outcome. It's a spectacle that borders on the farcical. And while political theater may be entertaining for some, the ultimate show that plays out on our everyday lives could be far from a box office hit. Of course, no discussion would be complete without addressing the fiscal fantasy that underpins this tariff strategy. Trump's tariffs are touted as a crucial revenue source designed to help renew and extend tax cuts, a claim that politicians are fond of repeating. Yet empirical studies from institutes such as the Brookings Institution and the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, paint a starkly different picture. Their analyses show that while tariffs can generate revenue in the short run, the net impact on the economy tends to be negative over the long term, as higher prices squeeze economic growth and reduce consumer spending. Consider the latest data. In 2022, U.S. customs duties generated approximately $38 billion in revenue. In contrast, estimates suggest that the additional tariffs on high import items could eventually add only a modest increment to federal coffers, if they do not simultaneously trigger retaliatory measures that shrink overall trade volumes. When global trade contracts, the entire tax base shrinks, threatening to undo decades of fiscal policy achievements. Essentially, this tariff strategy may end up being a fiscal self-sabotage, ensuring that the promised rich nation remains a pipe dream as businesses curtail investments and consumers tighten their belts. As we stitch together the disparate threads of this tariff debacle, a broader picture emerges, one that lays bare the inherent flaws of policy crafted in the hallowed halls of political expediency rather than sound economic reasoning. The setting of these tariffs is symptomatic of a governance style that favors short-term headlines over long-term economic stability. Rather than engaging in robust, data-driven policymaking, we see policy prescriptions that are more about political theater than practical solutions. A case in point is the repeated use of tariffs as a scapegoat for much larger economic issues. Instead of addressing the structural problems, be it inadequate infrastructure, a slowly evolving technological ecosystem, or the complexities of global migration, the administration opts for blunt instruments that promise dramatic, albeit illusory, results. Meanwhile, millions of Americans who are already feeling the pinch of rising living costs are left to bear the brunt of a policy that is, at its core, misguided at best and disastrous at worst. The recent decision to impose these tariffs is but the latest chapter in a long saga of economic miscalculations that many argue are driving us closer to recessionary chaos. A report published earlier this year by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBR, warned that protectionist measures coupled with disorganized fiscal policies could reduce GDP growth by as much as 1.5% annually over the next few years. For everyday citizens and financial professionals alike, these are not mere numbers on a paper, they represent real hardships, potential job losses, and diminished purchasing power. In sum, the announcement of tariffs against Canada and Mexico, couched in the rhetoric of border security and national pride, is emblematic of a deeply flawed economic strategy. Despite lofty promises of economic rejuvenation, extremely liquid and rich again, as Trump so confidently puts it, the underlying policies risk stoking inflation, disrupting integrated supply chains, and igniting retaliatory measures from trusted allies. The optics may be politically compelling, but the economic fundamentals tell a harsher tale. For professionals in finance and economics, and for any citizen concerned about the state of our financial markets, the lesson is clear: turning to protectionism in a globalized economy is a recipe for disaster. Instead of harnessing technology, reforming outdated regulatory structures, and investing in infrastructure, we are being led down a path where short-term political stunts could inflict long-term damage. The repercussions of such mismanagement are not confined to abstract economic models but resonate in every wallet, every factory, and every supply chain across the continent. It is high time for policymakers to move beyond the theatrics of tit-for-tat tariffs and embrace a coherent, forward-looking economic strategy that prioritizes innovation, collaborative international trade, and comprehensive reform over populist posturing. Only by doing so can we hope to stave off the deepening recession that so many forecasters warn is on the horizon. So, as we sit back and watch this latest episode in the global trade drama, let's remember that while political leaders may promise gold and glory through tariff-induced revenue and job creation, the stark reality is that economic progress requires thoughtful, nuanced policy, not a one-size-fits-all, if they charge us, we charge them, mentality. Stay alert, stay informed, and keep questioning the policies that, in the end, affect every facet of our economic lives. After all, in this age of rapid change, the only tariffs that truly charge us are those imposed on our collective future.